Imagine buying a home in a picture-perfect neighborhood, only to have your car declared too ugly to exist there. That's exactly what happened to Mark, when his nosy neighbor Karen decided his perfectly legal sedan was an eyesore. She launched complaint after complaint, dragging the HOA into the fight. But what she didn't expect was that Mark would dig into the rulebook, find the ultimate loophole, and flip the entire neighborhood against her. This is the story of how one car exposed the most power-hungry Karen on the block. Chapter 1: The First Complaint. The neighborhood was the kind of place where perfection was expected and enforced. Every lawn had to be trimmed exactly the same length, every mailbox painted in regulation colors, and every home maintained to the association's narrow standard of acceptable aesthetics. It was the sort of neighborhood that looked good on real estate brochures, but for those who lived there, the constant scrutiny could become suffocating. For months, things had been relatively quiet for Mark, the homeowner at the center of this story. He lived a modest life, worked a steady job, and took pride in paying his dues and minding his own business. His car, though not new, was dependable. It was an older model sedan, with a faded blue paint job that had dulled over the years. It wasn't flashy, but it wasn't a rusted-out heap either. It was just average. And that, apparently, was a problem for one person in particular, Karen. Karen lived 3 houses down, and she had a reputation for micromanaging the neighborhood. From reporting trash cans left out a few hours too long to criticizing the seasonal decorations others placed in their yards, she had made herself the unofficial enforcer of neighborhood standards. Most neighbors avoided her, hoping not to draw her attention. But when she set her sights on Mark's car, avoiding her was no longer an option. The first complaint came in the form of a neatly typed letter, slipped under Mark's door. It wasn't from the HOA board directly, but from Karen herself. She claimed his car was an eyesore and detracted from the value of the neighborhood. She demanded he either repaint it or park it out of sight in his garage. The irony, of course, was that Mark's garage was full of storage boxes and tools, and his car was parked in his driveway, just like dozens of others in the neighborhood. Mark brushed it off at first. After all, Karen had no real authority. He told himself it was just one of her usual busybody antics. But Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. Within a week, a second letter arrived, this time written on official HOA stationery. It contained a formal notice stating that his vehicle was in violation of aesthetic standards. The problem? No such clause actually existed in the HOA's rules. Still, the letter came with a warning: failure to comply could result in fines. Mark was both annoyed and suspicious. He suspected Karen had used her connections with the HOA board to push this through. After all, she was known to attend every meeting and loudly voice her opinions about neighborhood integrity. It seemed all too likely that she had convinced a few board members to target him. Instead of reacting impulsively, Mark decided to start keeping records. He filed away the letters, made notes about the dates, and took photos of his car in the driveway. If Karen wanted a fight, he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of catching him unprepared. But Karen wasn't done. A week later, Mark returned home to find a violation notice taped directly to his windshield. This one threatened a $100 fine if the unsightly vehicle remained in the driveway. That was the breaking point. Mark wasn't the kind of person who looked for conflict, but he wasn't about to be bullied either. He decided it was time to fight back, not with yelling, not with pettiness, but with knowledge. He pulled out the HOA's governing documents and began reading them line by line. Page after page, he looked for any mention of vehicles, aesthetics, or driveway restrictions. What he found was interesting: rules about abandoned cars, broken-down vehicles, and RVs parked too long, yes. But nothing, absolutely nothing, about a car being too ugly. His sedan was fully operational, properly registered, and legally parked. By every definition, it was compliant. And that was when a new thought crossed his mind: if Karen and the HOA wanted to play this game, then he would use their own rules against them. The seed of an idea began to form, one that would not only shut Karen down, but also expose the HOA's hypocrisy for everyone in the neighborhood to see. The first complaint had started this mess. But it would be the last time Karen had the upper hand. End of Chapter 1. Next, Chapter 2 begins as Mark starts planning his counterattack. Chapter 2, Digging Deeper. Mark spent the following days poring over the HOA's governing documents, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC and RS. For most homeowners, the thick binder of legal jargon gathered dust in a drawer. But for Mark, it had suddenly become the most important book in the house. He treated it like a puzzle, highlighting sections and sticking notes along the margins. The deeper he went, the more patterns he noticed. The HOA was strict about many things, but their wording was precise. Vehicles could not be abandoned. They could not leak fluids onto driveways. They had to be registered and roadworthy. But nowhere, in any section, was there language about the appearance of a car. There was nothing about faded paint, nothing about unsightly vehicles, and certainly nothing about a car being too ugly. The violation notices Karen had stirred up were built on sand. That much was clear. But proving it would take more than just pointing to a page in the rulebook. The HOA board was known to bend interpretations to suit their agenda, and with Karen whispering in their ears, Mark knew logic alone wouldn't win the fight. He needed something stronger: precedent, leverage, and exposure. So he began to observe. On his evening walks, he casually scanned the neighborhood for other cars. He noticed an older pickup truck with visible rust parked just 2 streets over. He spotted a neighbor's faded minivan with a cracked bumper. He even saw a sporty convertible with a torn soft top sitting in a driveway for weeks. None of these vehicles had ever received a violation notice. He documented them all, carefully snapping discrete photos. If Karen and the board wanted to claim his sedan was a problem, then why were these others ignored? The hypocrisy was glaring. Meanwhile, Karen's campaign escalated. She wasn't satisfied with just violation notices. She began spreading whispers at block gatherings, calling Mark's car junk and claiming it brought down property values. She even made a scene one morning, loudly gesturing at his driveway while on the phone, as if reporting a crime in progress. Mark kept his cool. Outwardly, he showed no reaction. Inwardly, he was sharpening his strategy. He realized Karen's greatest weapon was intimidation, but intimidation only worked when people felt powerless. The moment the power shifted, her authority would collapse. That's when Mark uncovered the loophole. Buried in the CC and RS was a clause allowing homeowners to file formal grievances against the HOA board for overreach, provided they had evidence of inconsistent enforcement. Not only that, but the clause required the grievance to be read aloud at the next community meeting, in front of every attending neighbor. This was exactly what Mark needed. He wouldn't just defend himself. He would turn the spotlight onto the board and onto Karen. Still, he knew he had to be methodical. Filing the grievance would make him a target. And the HOA would push back hard. He needed every detail to be airtight. Over the next week, he compiled a binder of evidence, photographs of other cars, copies of every violation notice he had received, and highlighted sections of the CC and RS. He even researched property law, ready to cite the exact language that proved his compliance. As the date of the next HOA meeting approached, Mark felt both nervous and resolute. He wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't a politician, he was just a regular guy with an old car. But he was about to challenge the system that Karen thought she controlled. And unbeknownst to her, he wasn't just fighting back. He was setting the stage for a showdown that would expose everything she had been doing, not just to him, but to others in the neighborhood as well. The trap was set. All he had to do now was wait for the meeting to begin. End of Chapter 2. Next, Chapter 3 begins as Mark confronts the HOA board at the meeting, and Karen makes her move. Chapter 3, The Showdown. The evening of the HOA meeting arrived, and the clubhouse buzzed with the usual low hum of conversation. Neighbors shuffled into folding chairs, some clutching copies of the agenda, others simply there to observe. For most residents, these meetings were tedious affairs filled with discussions about landscaping budgets and seasonal events. But this time, tension hung in the air. Mark walked in with his binder tucked under his arm. He had spent hours organizing it, making sure every document, every photograph, every note was in perfect order. He wasn't there to argue or plead. He was there to present facts. Karen was already seated near the front, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the room like a self-appointed watchdog. She wore a smug expression, clearly anticipating another step toward her goal of having Mark's car hidden from view. She had convinced herself that the HOA board would back her completely, just as they always had. The meeting began in the usual fashion: roll call, approval of minutes, budget updates. But Mark wasn't listening. He was waiting. His grievance was listed under new business, and the anticipation in his chest grew heavier as the board worked through the agenda. Finally, his name was called. The president of the HOA, a man who often deferred to the loudest voices in the room, glanced down at the paper in his hand and said, "Next item, a formal grievance filed by Mark regarding vehicle violations." A ripple of curiosity passed through the crowd. Few homeowners ever bothered to file grievances. The floor was his. Mark stood, placed his binder on the table in front of the board, and began. His voice was steady, measured, and calm. He explained the repeated notices he had received about his car, citing the exact wording from each letter. Then, he flipped open the HOA's CC and RS and highlighted the absence of any rules regarding vehicle appearance. He read aloud the clauses about registration, functionality, and safety, every box his car checked without issue. Next, he unveiled his evidence, photographs of other cars in the neighborhood that bore the same or worse cosmetic flaws than his own. He pointed out the rusted pickup, the faded minivan, the torn convertible roof. "If my car is a violation," he said, "then so are these. Yet none of these residents have received notices. That's selective enforcement, and the CC and RS are clear: selective enforcement is a breach of board responsibility." The room grew quieter with each page he turned. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering to one another. Even the board members exchanged uneasy glances. Karen, however, couldn't stay silent. She interrupted, insisting that Mark's car was different and more offensive than the others. She raised her voice, claiming she was protecting property values and acting in the community's best interest. But the more she spoke, the more she revealed her personal vendetta. Mark didn't respond to her directly. He didn't need to. He simply read the clause from the CC and RS that required grievances to be addressed openly, with consistency and fairness. The words weren't his, they were the HOA's own. And they cut through Karen's protests like a knife. By the time he closed his binder, the room was silent. The board was cornered. They couldn't argue with their own governing documents, and they couldn't ignore the evidence without looking complicit. For the first time, Karen's authority cracked. The president cleared his throat and said the matter would be taken under advisement. It was a weak response, but everyone in the room knew what it meant: the board had been caught, and they were scrambling for a way out. Mark sat back down, his heart still pounding, but he kept his composure. He hadn't won yet, but he had shifted the balance of power. Karen's face was flushed with anger, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. She wasn't used to losing, and she wasn't about to accept it quietly. As the meeting adjourned, whispers filled the air. Neighbors who had once rolled their eyes at Karen's antics now looked at her with suspicion. For the first time, she wasn't the enforcer. She was the problem. But Mark knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to back down after one setback. If anything, she was about to double down. And when she did, the battle would escalate into something much bigger than one car in a driveway. End of Chapter 3. Next, Chapter 4 begins as Karen strikes back, trying to bend the rules even further to get her way. Chapter 4. Karen strikes back. The days following the HOA meeting were uneasy. The neighborhood, once indifferent to board politics, buzzed with chatter about what had unfolded. For many residents, Mark had voiced what they had quietly felt for years, that the rules were not always applied fairly. Some even approached him privately, offering thanks for standing up to the board. But while some neighbors were impressed, Karen was humiliated. And humiliation, for someone like her, quickly turned into vengeance. It began subtly. One morning, Mark woke to find his trash cans knocked over, their contents scattered across his lawn. At first, he thought it might have been raccoons or the wind, but the pattern repeated itself week after week. Then came the strange, anonymous notes taped to his door, handwritten messages calling him a rule-breaker and neighborhood disgrace. Mark suspected Karen immediately. The tone of the notes mirrored her pompous speeches, and the timing was too convenient. But she wasn't reckless enough to sign her name. She was waging a quiet, petty war, hoping to wear him down. Yet she wasn't satisfied with just harassment. Karen wanted the HOA back on her side, so she began pushing the board to amend the CC and RS. She lobbied for a new clause that would give the association authority to regulate the aesthetic impact of vehicles. On paper, it sounded broad, but everyone knew it was aimed squarely at Mark's car. She started a petition, going door to door with her trademark fake smile and exaggerated warnings about declining property values. Some neighbors signed to avoid confrontation, others out of genuine belief in her rhetoric. But not everyone agreed. Word spread quickly that Karen was pushing for more control, and the petition became a dividing line in the community. Mark stayed calm. He knew from reading the CC and RS that changing the bylaws wasn't easy. It required a majority vote from homeowners, not just board approval. And that gave him time to prepare his next move. Meanwhile, Karen grew bolder. She began reporting every minor detail about Mark's property, from a patch of weeds on the side yard to a garden hose left out overnight. Each complaint generated yet another notice from the HOA. It was clear she hoped to bury him under a mountain of fines and warnings until he either gave in or moved out. But instead of breaking him, her attacks only fueled his determination. Mark began documenting everything with meticulous care. He took time-stamped photos of his lawn, his trash cans, even his mailbox. He recorded dates and times of every violation notice, cross-referencing them with the HOA's own inspection policies. Slowly, he was building a case that revealed a pattern of targeted harassment. What Karen didn't realize was that her own behavior was starting to backfire. Neighbors who had once tolerated her meddling now saw her true colors. They noticed how she targeted Mark obsessively, while overlooking others' infractions. Some even grew fearful that if she succeeded against him, they might be her next target. The turning point came when Karen tried to escalate matters further. She filed a complaint with the city, claiming Mark's car violated local codes. An inspector was dispatched, and Mark braced for the worst. But after a quick look, the inspector laughed it off. The car was perfectly legal. The complaint was dismissed on the spot. Mark couldn't help but smile. Karen's desperation was showing, and her credibility was unraveling. Still, he knew the battle wasn't over. The HOA vote on Karen's proposed amendment loomed on the horizon, and if she managed to rally enough support, she could win. But Mark had no intention of letting that happen. He had a plan, one that would not only secure his position but also ensure Karen could never wield her influence the same way again. The neighborhood was on edge. Lines had been drawn. And as the date of the vote approached, everyone waited to see whether Karen's crusade would succeed, or collapse under the weight of her own obsession. End of Chapter 4. Next, Chapter 5 begins as the community vote approaches, and Mark sets his trap to expose Karen once and for all. Chapter 5. The Vote. The HOA clubhouse hadn't seen a turnout like this in years. On the night of the vote, nearly every homeowner showed up, some curious, others anxious, and a few ready for a fight. Word had spread quickly that a new amendment was on the table, one that would give the HOA sweeping power over what vehicles could be parked in the neighborhood. Though the language was vague, everyone knew the truth. This was Karen's proposal, and it was aimed directly at Mark. Karen arrived early, dressed as if she were chairing a corporate board meeting. She smiled, shook hands, and handed out printed flyers filled with exaggerated claims about unsightly vehicles and the risk of falling property values. She positioned herself as the savior of the community, the only one willing to take a stand against what she called neighborhood decay. Mark, on the other hand, was calm and deliberate. He carried the same binder he had used at the last meeting, now thicker with new documentation. He didn't hand out flyers or knock on doors. He simply waited for the moment when the board would open the floor. His silence unnerved Karen. She was expecting resistance, but the absence of overt campaigning made her nervous. The meeting began with routine business, but the tension was palpable. Everyone knew what was coming. Finally, the president of the HOA introduced the proposed amendment. He read it aloud, and the room grew restless. Some nodded in agreement. Others frowned, already suspicious of its intent. Karen rose to speak, her voice polished and rehearsed. She painted a picture of declining home values, of buyers turning away at the sight of a single, dilapidated vehicle. She gestured toward Mark's driveway as if presenting evidence, careful not to mention his name but leaving no doubt about who she meant. She ended her speech with a dramatic plea, "This is about protecting our community." There was a smattering of applause, but also murmurs of dissent. The board then opened the floor for responses. That was Mark's cue. He stood, walked to the front, and opened his binder. His approach was calm, almost clinical. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't attack Karen directly. Instead, he presented facts. He explained how the CC&RS already covered abandoned or unsafe vehicles, ensuring the neighborhood wasn't burdened by genuine eyesores. Then he displayed the photographs he had collected of other cars, rusted, dented, even half-repaired, none of which had ever received a notice. Selective enforcement, he said plainly, pointing to the highlighted clauses in the CC&RS. That's what this is. Rules applied to some, ignored for others. And when that happens, the board itself is in violation. The room shifted uneasily. Homeowners who had been indifferent before now leaned forward. Some whispered, recognizing their own cars in the photographs. Karen's supporters began to waver. Then Mark revealed the trump card. He described the city inspector's visit, explaining how Karen had filed a complaint against him with municipal authorities, a complaint that was dismissed immediately as baseless. Gasps rippled through the room. Suddenly, this wasn't about property values. It was about harassment. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice rising in protest, but the damage was done. Her reputation, once feared and begrudgingly respected, crumbled in front of her neighbors. Instead of seeing a protector of property values, they saw a bully who weaponized rules for personal grudges. When the time came to vote, the ballots told the story. The amendment didn't just fail, it was crushed. A majority voted against it, and several even muttered about recalling board members who had supported it in the first place. Karen sat stone-faced, her flyers crumpled in her lap. For Mark, it was a victory, but not one he celebrated outwardly. He knew Karen well enough to realize she wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. She had lost the battle, but she would search for another way to strike back. Still, for the first time, the neighborhood had turned against her. She was no longer the loudest voice in the room. Her influence had cracked. And that gave Mark the opening he needed to finish what he had started. The war wasn't over, but the tide had shifted. The final chapter was yet to come, and Karen's downfall was closer than ever. End of Chapter 5. Next, Chapter 6 begins as Karen makes one last desperate move, and Mark delivers the final blow that ends her reign of HOA terror. Chapter 6, The Final Blow. Karen's defeat at the vote should have been the end of it. Most people, faced with overwhelming rejection from their neighbors, would have stepped back, licked their wounds, and perhaps reflected on how far they had gone. But Karen wasn't most people. For her, losing was intolerable. The more her influence slipped, the more desperate she became to claw it back. In the weeks after the failed amendment, she doubled down on her personal vendetta. Anonymous complaints continued to flood the HOA's inbox, each one targeting Mark for trivial issues. A lawn chair left on his porch overnight. A garden hose coiled imperfectly. Even a bird feeder that attracted too many sparrows. Every petty observation was weaponized into a violation notice. But what Karen failed to realize was that every notice, every piece of paper, was more ammunition for Mark. He was still documenting everything, still building his case. What had started as a binder was now 2 binders, each filled with pages of evidence showing her obsessive targeting. He wasn't just preparing to defend himself anymore, he was preparing to take Karen down for good. The opportunity arrived when another HOA meeting was scheduled, this one focused on community grievances. Mark submitted his evidence packet ahead of time, ensuring it was included on the official agenda. When the night came, the room was packed again. The air was heavy with anticipation. By now, everyone knew something explosive was brewing. Mark waited patiently as the board worked through the formalities, his binders stacked neatly at his feet. When his turn came, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply presented the facts, one by one. He displayed the timeline of complaints, showing how every single violation against him was filed within days of his confrontation with Karen. He showed side-by-side photos of his property and others, highlighting how similar conditions went ignored unless his name was attached. He even presented the anonymous notes, the handwriting suspiciously similar to Karen's letters from months before. Then he delivered the final blow. He produced the city inspector's report, confirming that Karen had filed a false complaint against him. Filing false reports, he explained, was not only harassment, it was a violation of city code. The room erupted with whispers and gasps. The board members, who had long allowed Karen to sway their decisions, now sat stiff and uneasy. They had no defense, no way to justify the pattern laid bare in front of them. Karen tried to interject, her voice shrill and panicked, but the board president silenced her. For the first time, she was told firmly to sit down. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted completely. Neighbors who had once feared Karen's scrutiny now turned on her. Several stood up, voicing their own experiences of being targeted, of receiving frivolous notices and condescending lectures. It became clear that Karen's behavior wasn't just a grudge against Mark, it was a pattern that had poisoned the neighborhood for years. The board had no choice. They announced an immediate review of all complaints filed by Karen, past and present. They also scheduled a recall vote to determine whether she should remain on the board's enforcement committee, where she had quietly exerted influence for so long. By the end of the night, Karen's reign was effectively over. Her credibility was shattered, her allies abandoned her, and the community she claimed to protect now saw her for what she was, a bully who had gone too far. For Mark, the victory wasn't about revenge. It was about fairness. His car, the faded blue sedan that had sparked the entire ordeal, still sat in his driveway. It hadn't changed. It was the same dependable vehicle it had always been. The only difference now was that no one dared call it an eyesore again. The neighborhood gradually returned to normal in the weeks that followed. People still trimmed their lawns and followed the rules, but the constant fear of being reported began to fade. Without Karen's iron grip, there was room for a little more humanity, a little more tolerance. And as for Karen? She kept to herself, her influence reduced to whispers behind closed doors. The woman who once thrived on control now found herself powerless. Mark never sought to humiliate her, but the result was the same. The final blow had landed, not in anger, but in truth. And the truth had stripped Karen of the one thing she valued most, authority. The battle over one ugly car had ended in a way no one could have predicted, not with fines, not with compliance, but with justice. End of chapter 6. The story concludes with Karen's downfall and Mark's quiet victory.